Okay, so we're going to be thinking about for this week as well. This week is also a double parsha. You have Acharei and Kedoshim. So Acharei is very interesting. It talks about the service of the high priest on Yom Kippur. And that seems to be very much connected to the theme of the book of Leviticus, which is, in the way the rabbis refer to it, is Torah Kohanim, the laws of the priests. So it starts with offerings, and it tells you all about the laws of the conduct in the temple. Then we have purity and impurity, because that's associated with the temple, when one is allowed to go to the temple and when not. Okay, that's all good. The question then becomes, what happens next? Next is Yom Kippur. So Yom Kippur fits right in to the discussion about holiness, about the priests. It's all about when the high priest is allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. It's also a continuation to the story of the two sons of Aaron who went into the Holy of Holies without authorization, and the negative consequence that occurred to them. Okay, fine. Then what do you have now? Now you have Kedoshim. Kedoshim is the second parsha. The name of the parsha is holiness, and it's God telling Moshe to gather all the Jewish people together and tell them, Kedoshim to you, you shall be holy. This is very interesting, because conventionally speaking, who do we think is holy? We think the priests are holy. Aaron is holy. Going on Yom Kippur is holy. Going into the Holy of Holies is holy. But now it says, no, be holy. And what are the cases that it spreads out? What are the cases that it spells out? It's what we would call just being holy in the regular life, the way you treat people, the way you treat the poor, the way you treat the person less fortunate, just regular daily living. In other words, sanctifying your life is the ultimate holiness. So that's very interesting, because even in the book of Leviticus, we tend to think of holiness as being separate from life, but reality is the Torah refers to this portion as being holy, because that's what true holiness. True holiness is if you could be holy within your daily life, bringing the holiness to the daily life. Okay, there are many, many commandments in the portion of Kedoshim. We could talk, there's many, but we'll talk about one. And this is a very famous verse. And the verse says, Lo ta'amod adam re'acha, do not, this is chapter 19, verse 16 of the book of Leviticus. Do not stand idly by. Lo ta'amod, literally, don't stand on your brother's blood. That's what the verse says. And what does it mean? So we want to look at Rashi, which is what we're going to do. Rashi says to watch his death, and you can save him. Meaning, don't stand, and that's why in the English they translate, don't stand idly by. Don't just stand there watching the person die, and you could save him. That's what Rashi says. Which sounds straightforward, but as we know, we discussed this in the past, this is actually a novelty, because if you look at other systems of law, the system of law we live in, common law countries, even if you're living in Israel, well, Israel, they changed the law. But in any case, generally in common law countries, what happens is there is no obligation to step in and save somebody. There are exceptions to the rule if you're a teacher, if you have responsibility, etc. But as a rule, there is no obligation, no legal obligation to be able to have to step in and save somebody. You don't even have to stop and call the authorities. You don't have to call the police. You don't have to call the ambulance. Somebody could just collapse in front of you, and you can continue sipping your coffee, because we live in a land that is free and people have personal autonomy, and nobody can tell me that I have to stop what I'm doing to save somebody else. That's the system of law we live in under common law countries. In most states, there are some states that try to change the law. Israel changed the law and they call it Lo ta'amod adam re'acha, don't stand idly by. And because the Torah says no, the Torah says unequivocally, you have to step in. You're not allowed to stand when you see the person die. You have to step in and save. So that's what the verse says, and that's what Rashi clarified. What's going to happen now? What's going to happen now is very interesting. The question is that the Rebbe asks. Let's just read the whole Rashi, then I'll give you the series of questions. So Rashi says what we said before, which is to see the person's death, and you can save him. And then Rashi continues. For example, if someone drowns in the desert, someone's drowning in the river, and a beast or robbers are coming on him. In other words, Rashi is bringing examples of finding somebody in a dangerous situation. How do you find someone in a dangerous situation? If he's drowning and there's a beast or a robbers coming upon him. Okay, fine. So that is the Rashi. And this Rashi looks like a very straightforward Rashi. But there are so many questions on the Rashi. And this commentary of the Rebbe is absolutely brilliant, at least in my opinion. The first question we have to ask is, this is a straightforward verse. Don't stand by your brother's blood. Did Rashi tell you anything that's rocket science? Did Rashi tell you anything that you didn't know before? What does Rashi say? Rashi says that it means, what does it mean don't stand on your brother's blood? It means to see his death and you can't save him. And then Rashi brings an example. So let's start with the first clause. What is he teaching us? Obviously, that's what the verse means. What else does the verse mean? What else does the verse mean? When the verse says, do not stand idly by your brother's blood, obviously it means that the person is in danger and you could save it. So what is Rashi's adding to the discussion? That is question number one. Question number two is, there could be so many examples of somebody in danger. So why does Rashi specifically use this example? For example, someone drowning and animals or robbers coming upon him. There's so many examples. Everyone understands people can be in danger. Why does Rashi offer these examples? Examples in general, these examples in particular. These are the two general questions. There are some specific questions. One interesting question is Rashi's wording is to see his death and you can save him. And the question is, what does Rashi mean when he says, and you can save him? Obviously, we're referring to a case where you can save him. If you cannot save him, then we're not talking to you, obviously. So why does Rashi say when you can and you can save him? Rashi says, the Rebbe says the question becomes even greater because if you want to look at Rashi's sources, where Rashi took this commentary from, so there'll be two sources, either in the Medrash, Taras Kain, in the Medrash of on Leviticus, or in Talmud Tractate Sanhedrin. In both those cases, it doesn't say you can save him. It says you are obligated to save him. Ata chayav, you're obligated to save him. So why does Rashi change the wording of his source and use a phrase which is now it's obvious. Obviously, we're talking to somebody who can save. So these are some of the questions. I'm just going to repeat them quickly, and then we'll get to sort of the broader idea here. So what are the questions? Number one, first of all, what is Rashi adding? The verse says, "Don't stand by your brother's blood." Obviously, it means you should not watch the person in danger, but rather you should step in. So what does Rashi have to say? You see his death and you can save him. What does Rashi have to say? That's obvious. Also the examples. Why do you have to bring these examples? In general, we think of any other example. A person can figure out when a person's in danger, you step in. What the danger is, who cares? And so that was one question. The other question is, so that was, first question is, what is Rashi adding? Second question is, why does Rashi bring in examples? Why does Rashi need an example and why these examples? And another question is, what is the phraseology, and you can save him? Unlike Rashi's sources, which says, and you are obligated to save them. That we understand what it means. You were saying, if you see, you're obligated to save. Rashi says, don't stand. You could, if you see the person dying and you can save him. Obviously, we're talking about someone who can save. If he cannot save, we're not talking about it. We're not talking to him. So these are some of the questions. There's more questions, but we'll stick with these. And what we're going to try to do here is we're going to give a few interpretations. There's a few layers to the commentary here, but in some sense, what we're going to say with this sort of innocent-looking Rashi, with these words, Rashi basically gives us the parameters of when you are obligated to step in and when you are not. So that's the big idea. Before you learn the Rebbe's commentary, Rashi is not telling you anything really. He's not really telling you anything you didn't know. right? The verse says, don't stand by idly on your brother's blood. Don't stand by your brother's blood. And Rashi says to see that he's dying and you can save him, for example, is not really adding anything. Hence the first question, what's Rashi adding? But based on the commentary that the Rebbe is going to offer, not only is he adding, he's actually giving you he's actually giving you parameters of when this mitzvah applies and how it applies and when it doesn't apply. And that's before we even get to the mystical side, which adds another dimension. Okay. Yeah, so far so good. Any comments, questions, please share. Otherwise, we continue and we go straight to the begin the commentary.
Okay. Is anything said about the connection from the first part of the psuk about gossip related to saving people?
Yeah. Why gossip? So the Rebbe doesn't address it directly, but if I'm not mistaken, from memory, the point here is that it's sort of the same idea that gossip is causing harm, and gossip is not direct damage, but indirect damage, right? You spreading gossip, I'm harming someone, I'm harming their reputation, etc. But you could say, well, I'm not harming the guy, so what's the problem? So the mitzvah is telling us that you shouldn't go gossiping, even though you're not harming the person directly, you're harming the person indirectly. And similarly, what we're saying over here is refraining from helping. I'm not causing damage, the person is drowning, it's not me. But refraining from helping, in some sense, falls in that same category. That you see someone is vulnerable, you have to save him. That's the second clause of the verse. The first clause of the verse, don't cause damage. So I would say the first clause of the verse is don't cause damage, even indirectly. And the second clause of the verse is don't cause damage even by being passive, but rather be active. So it's the same theme in the sense of not only am I not allowed to harm someone actively and directly, but I can't harm someone indirectly or by being passive. So I think that the overarching idea is the causing harm to the other person.
And there's a comparison rate of gossiping and harm, or embarrassing someone and murdering them, right?
Yes. So, right. The Talmud says that someone who it's really, I don't know if it's gossip so much, but it's more of embarrassing. Embarrassing somebody is like spilling the blood. And commentaries bring an example. The person is, you embarrass the person turns white. It sort of drains their face from the blood. That's a form of spilling blood. It's a form of death. Then we have the other interpretation from the story from Tamar, where Tamar doesn't want to embarrass Yehuda, even though she has the signs that he was the father of her pregnant twins. And she just gave him the signs, and she said that I'm pregnant to the person who owns these. The Talmud says this teaches that in some sense a person should allow themselves to be thrown into fire because they were going to kill her because she was a daughter of a priest, rather than embarrass somebody else. So if you can kill yourself rather than embarrass, so then those things are equated. Okay, fine. Thank you for that. Oh, now I see another commentary. In the footnote, the Rebbe quotes other commentaries, and it's brought down by an early commentator called the Riva. And he says like this. What is the continuation? The continuation is like this. One way to read this. Don't gossip. Don't spread gossip. But what happens if you heard that somebody wants to harm your friend? Are you allowed to tell that person? Right? I know that somebody wants to harm my friend. So on one hand, I could say I can't say because I'm spreading gossip. So we say no, despite the fact that the Torah says do not spread gossip, nevertheless, you can't stand idly by your brother's blood. And if somebody is going to harm your brother, you have to tell. So that's another way of interpreting the connection in the first half of the clause. In the second half, that it's sort of limiting the first half. The first half says don't speak gossip. But if by being silent, somebody else is going to get hurt, then don't stand idly by. Tell that person. Right? So that's an interesting commentary, because it tells you that the second clause is the parameters of the first verse. Okay, fine. So let's go to our discussion for a minute. Let's go back for a moment and see what is Rashi adding here. Forget about what's the question when Rashi offers a commentary. There's something that is not understood about the verse. What is bothering? What's the problem when you read the verse? What don't you understand that requires Rashi to give a comment? So the question is the style of the words, style of the verse. In other words, what's the purpose of the verse? The purpose of the verse is to tell you, don't sit with your arms folded, be active. Save your brother. So the question is, why is this verse written in the negative, not in the positive? The verse should say, save your brother. Instead of don't stand idly by. It's more indirect, right? It's negating what you should not do. But if the purpose of the verse is to tell you to step in and save, then the far more appropriate style would be the active style, positive. Tell the person what he should do, not what he should not do. So why is the formulation of this verse in the form of do not stand idly by instead of save your brother? That is the underlying question that Rebbe says when you read this verse, especially because you're trying to generate action, you're trying to generate movement, right? So if you want to generate movement, speak in the active voice. Tell the person exactly what to do, right? So imagine there's an emergency. You have to call the ambulance. You don't tell somebody, oh, don't stand idly by. You say, call the ambulance. Right? If you speak in a direct voice, it's going to generate people to movement. So here you want to tell people to move. So say it directly. Why is the Torah choose the term that you chooses the words to use, chooses the style to say it indirect? Do not stand idly by. Negating. Just say, save your fellow. So here's a brilliant idea that Rebbe says. The Rebbe says like this: if the Torah tells you in a negative, it's because what it's telling you is that we're addressing a circumstance where one would think that they don't have to act. So the Torah has to say, don't stand idly by. In other words, like this: if a Torah says save somebody, and I'm the reader, I say, yeah, I'll save when I could save. But some cases I can't save, so I'll stand idle. So the Torah says, no. You think you could stand idle in these cases? Do not stand idly by. What are we talking about? We're talking about the question of, yes, you have to save your fellow. Yeah, we understand that. But the question is, what is the Torah referring to? Is the Torah referring to save your fellow when there's no danger to you? Or is the Torah saying much more than that? Is the Torah saying save the fellow even if saving the fellow requires that you take a certain degree of risk? That's a completely different commandment, right? The Torah says save your fellow. So I say, yeah, I'll save my fellow when I can. But if there's some risk to me, then I say, I can't do it. So I'm going to stand idly by. So when the Torah says don't stand idly by, the Torah is saying, even though you have a legitimate reason to stand idly by, because there's some risk to you, specifically in those cases, the Torah says don't stand idly by. So in other words, saying it in the negative means we're addressing a case where there would be reason to think that you don't have to save. where there would reason to think that standing idly by is okay. And the Torah says, do not stand idly by. Okay. Now we understand why Rashi brings his example. And when I was looking at this talk yesterday, I read the English botches it up. So in the Hebrew, Rashi says, going, for example, Tavei Benar, someone's drowning in a river. And then it says, Vi Chaya. And a beast, or listim, or robbers coming upon him. So the English translation that I read on Chabad.org, it said, for example, someone drowning in the river, or a beast or robbers are coming on him, meaning it's three separate cases. But the Rebbe says, no, it's not what Rashi says. Rashi says it's one case. Someone's drowning and, not or, someone's drowning and a beast and robbers are coming to save him, are coming upon him. So there's two problems for this guy. Number one, he's drowning. Number two, even if he manages to get out of the water, there's a beast or a robber waiting to attack. So drowning in the river doesn't necessarily mean that there's danger for the person's coming to save, right? It's very likely. I'm a lifeguard. I have a what do they call those things? A tube, life tube, or whatever else. I have a stick. So if someone's drowning, I could safely be on the shore, and I could save that person without putting myself into too much danger. So that's not a case that Rashi would address. Rashi says, look, no, in this case, there is some danger for the person who is going to, there is some danger for the person who is saving, because not only is the person drowning, and for that I don't have to put myself in danger. In other words, that doesn't jeopardize my well-being. But it's also a thief, is also an animal. If I pull that person out, I have to deal with the thief or the animal. Okay, so that's a certain amount of risk. And that's why Rashi says, I'm giving you an example where there is some degree of risk to the person saving. And that is why the Torah speaks in the negative. What the Torah is saying is, even though you would think that in this case, I don't have to save, because I have to save the other person if he's drowning, wonderful. But what happens if there's a wild beast trying to harm him, or a robber? If I step in, I'm putting myself in jeopardy. So I would think that I could stand idly by. Therefore, the Torah says, do not stand idly by, even in a case where you would think that you allowed to. So that's the first idea. That is, when do I have to get involved, even if there's some degree of risk? Our other question was, the other side of the coin, what about Rashi's words? Rashi says, and you can save him. Changing from the Talmud, changing from the Medrash, which says, and you are obligated to save him. Rashi says, you can save him. What does Rashi say? You can't save him. Obviously, you can save him. If you can't save him, you can't save him. So here's what the Rebbe says. The Rebbe says, okay, 1 second. That's the other side of the coin. The other side of the coin is, if there is no reasonable chance that you could save him, then you don't have to. So in other words, what Rashi is doing is giving us the parameters of the obligation. The obligation applies even if there's some degree of risk. That's on the one hand. Even if there's some degree of risk, I'm still obligated to interfere and help and save. On the other hand, it's not that I have to put myself in jeopardy in every circumstance. It's only if realistically I believe that I have a chance of success. And that is, and you can save him, and you can save him. And this is just touching upon Rashi's very brief, but there's a whole area of halachic inquiry of how much danger do I have to put myself in to save somebody else? Well, Rashi is not giving you the exact answer. I don't know if there's an exact answer, but Rashi is giving you the broad definition. The broad definition is, even some amount of danger you have to assume in order to save somebody else. On the other hand, if you think it's impossible to save, then you don't have to. Because Rashi says, that's Rashi's big idea. The big idea is, don't watch his death and you can save him, meaning, and there's a realistic chance that you can save him. So what we did this Rashi, we read the Rashi and we said, Rashi is not telling us anything. You need a metaphor to tell you when someone's in danger. I could think of 1,000 metaphors. You need a metaphor you have to tell me that we're talking about a case that you could save. Obviously, I can save. If I'm in the East Coast and the person's in the West Coast, I can't save him. Obviously, it's not. Obviously, the commandment doesn't apply. But according to the Rebbe's interpretation, this is beautiful, because what we're doing is we're telling you that you have to step in even if there's some degree of risk. However, if there's no realistic chance of saving, then you are exempt. So that's the big idea. Now we'll go to the mystical interpretation. So what is Rashi saying? Rashi says to see his death and you can save him. Doesn't say if. Literally, let's read it literally. Don't stand idly by to see his death and you can save him. That's what Rashi says. So you want to look at that from the mystical perspective. Okay, but I think Vicky's back. Oh, yeah, Vicky. So I'm just going to repeat what we said very quickly because just to summarize. According to the Rebbe's interpretation, what Rashi is really doing here, Rashi is giving us the parameters of this law. And the law applies even when there's some degree of danger for the person who has to save. Even then, I have to step in. And that's why Rashi brings an example of someone who's drowning, which, as we mentioned, drowning per se doesn't have to put the person saving in jeopardy, because a person can be drowning in a river. It's not even an ocean, it's a river. Drowning in a river, but I could stand under dry land and save that person. Doesn't necessarily put me at risk. But then Rashi says that the metaphor Rashi, the example that Rashi brings, not the metaphor, the example Rashi brings is that there's a double danger. The person is drowning and an animal or a beast are coming upon him. So in that case, if I step in to save that person, I have to deal with the animal or with the beast or the thief. That's going to put me in some degree of danger. And that's what Rashi is saying. Rashi is saying, yes, the commandment not to stand idly by applies even if there's some degree of danger for the person saving. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, does it apply in every case? I can never stand idly by. No. There are times where you don't have to step in. When is that? If you cannot, realistically speaking, you don't think there's any chance that you could save. You don't have to put yourself in danger if you don't think you could save the person. And that's the meaning of Rashi's words, to see his death and you can save him. We mentioned that's changing what Rashi's source text says. Rashi's source text says to see his death and you are obligated to save him. That's obvious. Rashi doesn't have to say that. But Rashi is saying the obligation applies when realistically you can save him. So we have both extremes. On one hand, we're talking about cases where you are in other words, the obligation, we expand the obligation even to where there is danger to the person saving, some degree of danger your person has to assume. On the other hand, we have the limit of cases where you don't have to interfere if you can't save it. They have no obligation. The point is not to put yourself in harm. The point is to only do so if you think that you have the ability to save. So that's a Rashi's word. So from taking a Rashi would seem like it's not really adding anything. Now we see that Rashi is actually giving us the parameters of the commandment, the broad parameters, but parameters of the commandment. So that's the main, that's the body. And we have a little bit of mysticism to add, but any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise we go to the spiritual dimension.
So that parameter could also possibly hold for the idea of gossiping, of when to step in and stop someone from gossiping.
Yeah. In general, do I have to put myself at risk to stop the other person from being harmed? Right. So the answer is some degree of risk is okay, but only if it could be effective. If I have no hope of being effective, you don't do it. Right. That's what the Talmud says. That just like it's a mitzvah to say something that's going to be heard, because there's an obligation also in this week's parsha, rebuke your fellow. So the question is, I'm going to rebuke your fellow who's going to be upset at me. So do I have to do that? Well, forget about even if he's not going to be, even if he's not going to be effective, there's the idea that you don't have to say it's a mitzvah, just like it's a mitzvah to say something that has to be said, something that will be heard. So too, it's a mitzvah to refrain from saying something that will not be heard. There's no point of just speaking. The point is if it can be effective. Sometimes by speaking, you're just enraging the person, and it's not going to be effective. The point is not to soothe my conscience. The point is to be guilty. You know the story about this, right? With the banker. I think Vicky knows the story. I must have said it before, but I'll say it again. So there's a bank manager, and he's not, I forget, somewhere in Eastern Europe. He wasn't religious, but he had respect to the Rebbe of the town. And one day, a woman, a widow, comes to the Rebbe and she says, "I'm going to be evicted from my house. I can't pay the mortgage. I need help." So the Rebbe says, "Okay, let me go. I spoke to the bank manager. It's not. He says he can't do it. It's not his money. He's just a manager. He can't do it. Fine." So the Rebbe goes to this person, walks to this guy's house, knocks on the door, sees the Rebbe's here, he lets him in, he brings him some tea, and he says, "No, Rebbe, what do you want?" He says, "I can't speak. He can't speak. He motions that he can't speak. And the person's very super curious, but the Rebbe is not telling him why he came. After 45 minutes, he gets up and he says, why did you come? He said, I came to do a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? I can't say. And he leaves the house. He goes back home. This guy is so curious, this banker, he chases him down. He walks after the Rebbe. He says, Rebbe, please tell me why you came. Finally, the Rebbe says, look, I did a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? The Talmud says that just like it's a mitzvah to say something that is heard, it's a mitzvah to refrain from speaking something that will not be heard. And I know you can't help me, so I'm quiet. I know you're not going to help, so I'm quiet. He says, what's the matter? So he says, oh, it's this woman that she's going to be evicted by the bank. He says, Rebbe, what can I do? It's not my decision. So the Rebbe said, I told you that I can't speak, right? I told you it's not going to be effective. Finally, the guy decided he was was moved or whatever, and he decided he's going to pay his own money and pay down the mortgage. Okay, fine. So that's just a funny story where the Rebbe got what he wanted by fulfilling the mitzvah of not speaking. Fine. So that's the parameters of the mitzvah. Okay, now what we're going to do is what we do sometimes, and sometimes with the Hasidic interpretation, the most mystical interpretation is related to this. Just simply read the verses, read the words of the commentary, read the words of the Rashi, forget about the context, and you'll get some meaning. What does Rashi say? To see his death and you can save him. We're talking about don't stand by idly brother's blood, to see his death and you can save him. It says the Rebbe like this. The Rebbe says it about not just saving physical death, in other words, physical danger, but also saving from spiritual death. You see somebody drifting away from the spiritual source, drifting away from their heritage. That's spiritual death. You want to reconnect them. Says the Rebbe like this. The Baal Shem Tov teaches that anything that a person sees in this world is for a reason. There's a lesson. If I see something, there's a reason why I saw it. So the Rebbe says like this: Lirot b'mitato, to see his death. Why did God make that I should see this person's death or threat of death, either physical or spiritual? Why did I see that? It says that V'ata yachal hatzilai, because you can. Literally, it's to see his death and you can save him. What the Rebbe says is, if you saw his death, if you see the fact that he's in a dangerous position, that's an indication, in many cases, not in every case, but that's an indication that you can save him. In other words, what Rashi is telling you is that sometimes the reason why this came to your attention, the reason why you see it, is because you can't save. Because very often a person underestimates their own ability, and the person says, I can't do it. So what the Rebbe says, what Rashi is telling you is saying, one second, contemplate the fact that if God brought this to my attention, it could be it's because I actually do have the power to save. I think I can't, but I do have the power. So we evaluate that and contemplate that, and don't sell yourself short, and don't underestimate your abilities. So we started with the Rashi that we weren't sure what it's telling us. We ended up with Rashi is conveying a lot, either in the most legal question of when and what is the parameters of this law. And we said it means that it applies even when there's some risk. But on the other hand, you have to think that there's reasonable chance of success. That's the parameters of the law. And then mystically speaking, contemplate the fact that if I saw it, not always, but often, if I see it, if I saw this person in trouble, if I see this person in danger, if I see this person needs spiritual help, it could be that it's because I have the ability to save that person and to help that person. And I have to believe in my ability because I understand that if I saw it for a reason. So that's the story in short. Thank you for joining. I think this is a beautiful interpretation, both the legal side and the mystical side. But so thank you for joining, and comments, questions, of course, welcome. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. Okay, take care.